Coming to you live after a little bit of a break. Here, coming to you from the Grapevine Psychology office, and
Hello.
we are figuring it out.
It's good to see
And
you. Good to be back.
yes, it's been a good summer.
Yeah. Quick summer, but
So quick. I'm kind of weirded out because summer's usually my seasonal affective time,
mm, the heat, that's real.
and it's been late and more mild this summer. So it's like it has gone much faster because I think I've had more fun because I've been able to be outside and stuff more.
Yeah. Yeah, for anybody listening who maybe lives in a cooler climate, it does seem like pretty normal to have clients that, or, clients or us experience almost the opposite seasonal issues in the summer heat, the oppressive nature of it over and over and over. So I'm sure somebody somewhere is like, I would love a 100-degree day right now, but
And you would love a 100-degree day, not a string of them stitched together to weave you into the depths of despair. Anyway, not funny, but I feel happy to have you here and for us to be back together. And I was going to talk about a couple of things today, depending on how much we have time for. But one of the things I was going to talk about was a recent subpoena I received.
mm. And just even hearing that word, it's like one of those things that I think makes most therapists feel scared.
So this subpoena was for another clinician in my practice, but Grapevine Psychology is the custodian of the record. So there was a process happening where I had to make a decision to receive the subpoena. Thankfully, the process server was very patient and just easygoing and nice. And he was like, "You can look at it." And I literally had this experience of, but I've seen Dog the Bounty Hunter. If I touch it, I receive it. And I reach for it and then I pulled my hand back and he goes, I'm not going to do that to you. And so he let me kind of filter through and kind of see, and I was able to check some records. And it was a client of our record, a past client of record, but somebody in our system.
So let's go back a little bit. So maybe we can remind any listeners, when you get a subpoena, what's the process with that?
So the process that I am familiar with is that you're going to be served with papers. That's going to be a process server. Again, Dog the Bounty Hunter was a process server and also somebody who went and collected people with warrants to collect the bounties. And again, RIP to him. But a process server comes and that person works for the attorney who is paid to deliver um, and be able to document delivery of those papers. And so, like I said, this person was very nice. I've actually received a subpoena from him before for something different. So, but he was very nice and was very patient. So, but you'll often be served. I think you may be able to receive a subpoena in the mail. I don't know the details of that, so don't get me lying about it. But I do think that that can happen sometimes where you get it in the mail, mailed out by, and maybe that's the difference. I don't know. Maybe some of our listeners would be able to clarify, but maybe a subpoena that you get from a judge could come through the mail since it's different. That, a subpoena signed by a judge is different than a subpoena from an attorney. And I don't know if that rings any bells from your grad school ethics class or even the EPPP or something like that. But those are two very different experiences. So first, thoughts about that.
Well, yeah. So I think about grad school ethics or just generally like, if somebody's requesting your record, you don't have to do that unless your record gets subpoenaed. So just this idea that a subpoena is something that you have to respond to.
A subpoena is something that you have to respond to, but you don't necessarily have to release the records unless it's a court order signed by the judge. An attorney for whoever wants whoever's records can send a subpoena, and we do have to respond to it, but the response can be, we're not releasing records without court order. Depending on the situation, might depend on how we choose to approach that.
Gotcha. So you touch the document, kind of going back to the bounty hunter. So you have access to this document. So what was your process once the person comes to your door and gives you this?
There was a lot of thinking out loud for me. Thankfully, it was a Friday. I was here by myself, and so I was able to like take my time with it. But when he was here, again, I think this was a corner case in that he kind of let me think out loud and talk through questions without being overly rushy or kind of like, you touched it, it's yours now. Because one of the things that I was deciphering, especially from as a group practice owner, was that the clinician that the treating clinician or the rendering provider, which is insurance language and it wasn't insurance related, but the treating clinician is a clinician in my practice, and the client was a client of record in Grapevine Psychology. So technically, I didn't have to receive it on behalf of that clinician. And I could have been like, I'm not her, carry on. Um, but the thing is would have come back to me anyway, because Grapevine Psychology would have needed to manage the file transfer or file release. So I accepted it as the custodian of records. And so if for solo practitioners out there, it's going to be one and the same, where if somebody comes and they were like Carrie Lavelle, PhD, Grapevine Psychology, then that would have been, I was the client, I mean the clinician, and I was the custodian of the record. So there was no denying that. It was, like I said, with this other clinician, it was the same thing, that it was going to come back to Grapevine Psychology anyway to facilitate the records request. So I just accepted it.
And I guess why would somebody subpoena their file versus just contact Grapevine and say, hey, can I get my records released?
You ask such a reasonable question, Dr. Bewley. I don't know if there's something more formal about it being subpoenaed and being received by their attorney. I don't know if this was some kind of concern that we wouldn't release the record. I don't know, right? But I think that's a really good example of people coming in with kind of like um, heavy hitting unnecessarily. They had every right to request the record, and we would have provided it because we can't withhold it. Why they didn't just come to us is beyond me. So if you're a client listening to this, just ask your clinician or the agency that your clinician works in to provide you your record. You don't have to go through this rigmarole, because what I will share with you is that the process becomes much bigger on our side to make sure that we have the proper supports for it. Thankfully, the situation wasn't that complex. It was just a pain. So, but there are situations sometimes when people might subpoena their record, and it's really not therapeutically advantageous for them to have all of that. And those are the things that we read about in our ethics books in school. Thankfully, this wasn't quite that, but it was a litigious affair between two parties that we just happened to be drug into.
So when you got that, was there a consultation process that happened for you, and maybe just kind of how you handled that?
Yep. So the first thing that any of us should be thinking of when we get a subpoena for our records, whether it's for a client of ours or our agency, is I immediately scanned a copy of the paper. It was a hard copy subpoena. I scanned a copy of it and wrote an email. Well, I called my malpractice insurance and just said, I got a subpoena and I want some direction. They were like, yep, glad you called. This is what you need to do to facilitate that process, which was send an email to a specific address attaching the subpoena with my policy number. And I just said, receive this today. The named clinician is a clinician in my practice, and the client is a patient of record, and Grapevine Psychology, i.e. me, is the custodian of the record. So that's why I'm managing this. And so I sent that off on Friday, and kind of knowing that I was doing my due diligence from a ethical liability standpoint. And then I was contacted on Monday by somebody with the insurance who just said, we are assigning you a case. We are assigning you an attorney who's local to your area and knows the laws in those areas so that they can best facilitate this process with you. They couldn't offer me any advice specifically, but they are responsible for assigning me to someone who can. And so that was what happened on Monday. And then Tuesday, the attorney and I, so what happens is once your malpractice insurance assigns a case based on your coverage, and I have coverage for these kinds of things, and that coverage is general liability coverage. So everybody should have coverage for these kinds of things. And they assign me to an attorney who then does a conflict of interest check on their end to make sure that they may not be unknowingly representing the other side at the same time. Because, big firms might have people in different areas who are working for the same firm. So anyway, they do a conflict of interest check, and then they reach back out and say, hey, conflicts are clear. Let's talk about this. And so that is the next step. What was a worthy note that I'll talk about too is that the subpoena was due to be responded by Wednesday. And I didn't receive it until Friday. And then I didn't get even assigned to an attorney until Tuesday. And so that's a really quick turnaround. In previous experiences, I have received a subpoena on like the day before I was going out of town for a long, like out of country trip. And when I told them that, they were like, no problems. We'll file an extension, let them know the circumstances. Don't worry a lick about this on your trip. We'll handle it when we get back, which was great. And so I didn't have that circumstance here, but I did feel some concern about the tightness of the deadline and wanting to just have a little bit more time to get things together in a meaningful way. So I'll come back around to that. But I talked to the attorney. She read the subpoena. She had some questions that she wanted to clarify with the petitioner and the petitioning firm. And so she clarified some of those details. She got one of my release of information forms for them just so that I could have that on my side as well. And then we worked on exporting the file on Wednesday, and I'll stop there. Any questions or comments about that?
My comments are like, on top of a regular week, that just sounds very stressful and very time consuming,
Totally. I agree that it was, and it was further complicated. So regular week, oh crap, I've got to deal with this too. Thankfully there are, business stuff going. It was just so unideal, as an understatement. And so a complicating factor was that my EHR, which I will not name, I requested the export at 9:34 to be exact on Wednesday morning. And it was actually a pretty small file. And it was still exporting until hours later, to the point where at 4 p.m., I had to call help to say, I need this file exported. I requested it at 9:30 and it's not done yet. What's the deal? And evidently this was a known issue. Of course, I had no warning about that, hours later, that they were looking into, that exports were taking a really long time, which was shocking. And so that meant that I had to go and download every single piece of information one by one. And I'm pretty sure I got everything, but it's possible that I didn't. Everything of request, I think, was provided, but I was so frustrated. It took me at least an hour to do all of that. And with a fuller record where it was maybe a fuller course of treatment with 10 to 20 sessions, this was not. That would have taken so much longer because it would have been so much more opportunity for chart notes and treatment notes and billing documents and all of those things. So it was really frustrating.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds, and just the time crunch and, then having the EHR issue, that sounds like another layer of, taxing on you.
So then there was an affidavit that I had to go get notarized. And again, Wednesday was our deadline. And so this was the 4 o'clock hour. I'm trying to download all these pieces of information one by one. And I speak to the attorney, and she was like, well, if we can't get it to him by the end of today, then you'll have to appear in court on Friday. I said, what? I said, when I talk, so on Tuesday, when I talked to her, I said, there's no problem with me providing this information, but I do have a problem getting it in less than a week. And so I would like for you to preemptively just let them know, hey, we'll get this done by Friday, or maybe even the next Monday. But I'd like to not be held to a pretty ridiculous deadline. And she was like, yep, got it. And she didn't do it. And so I was really frustrated about that. And at this point, it was moot. And I said, I asked you to do that when we spoke yesterday so that we wouldn't be in this situation now. And I don't know, she had nothing to say. And so I don't know if I wasn't clear. I don't know if that's not custom procedure. But next time this happens, I will say I will be out of the office on this week, and it will be impossible for me to comply by the deadline. We need an extension. I'm going to say that regardless of where I am, so that there is no shadow of a possibility that this will happen again, where I'm going to UPS up the road to get a notary at 6 p.m. on this affidavit because my clinical day the next day was stacked. And I didn't want to have to go to the bank to do this, for free, because in the middle of my day before I had a really important meeting, it was just too much. It was too stressful. And so I was just really frustrated. It's over and we got it done, and, so on and so forth. But I think this is a really good reminder for people to be very clear. And I thought I was being clear, but apparently I wasn't. So there was a learning opportunity. But be very clear about what you can do with them up front so that they can know to seek that extension. It's not going to be weeks on end. It's going to be a few extra days for you to be able to get it done. Because had I had an extra day or two, the export came in at like 10 p.m. that night. So the next day, I could have just exported the file normally and not had an hour plus of exporting. So again, it was a good learning experience, but really frustrating. And, I think a good opportunity to use our clinical skills with people who aren't clinicians, i.e. the attorney, to say, when will you seek that extension? How will I know it's extended? And just be really clear about, are we on the same page that this is not going to happen by the deadline that's being requested?
Yeah, I really like how assertive you are. And even just my initial, it's a scary reaction. I think a lot of therapists can, especially with legal stuff, just be like, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, or, just follow the orders and don't ask questions. And I like how you're really encouraging, no, set boundaries, set limits, and ask what you need. And, just for, you know, law for dummies, can you share more specifically what the affidavit is and means?
Yeah. The affidavit is legally attesting who you are with your name. And in this specific affidavit, it was saying that there were 51 total pages of data being released. And that number came from the attorney, because what I ended up doing after I downloaded all of the documents is then I uploaded those into a secure web-based encrypted portal that they have. And then they put it all in one document. And that was a 51-page document. So I was attesting to who I was, my capacity to the case, i.e. the custodian of records, and then how many pages of data that I was releasing. And then it says something like, I attest that this is all of the record to the best of my knowledge, one of those kind of things, kind of like, you're making a deposition of sorts. It's just on paper and not showing up. And so that was what I had to have notarized, which says, which implies there's a legal responsibility that I have to be truthful.
it sounds like you took the whole process on more than the treating therapist.
Yeah, for a couple of reasons, because we are the custodian of records and would be facilitating that anyway. And, I've thought about this actually because, and this is, I think, this is personal, where person meets professional. I also wanted control over the process and I wanted to make sure that I understood it. And had I had the clinician, one, I received the subpoena, so I had legal responsibility. But let's say that the clinician, if I had not accepted it and then the clinician ended up getting it, they would still come to me. And I was like, hey, next steps, call your malpractice insurance, get a sense for what they want as next steps, et cetera. I could have done that, but it would have been then putting the therapist as that kind of like middle space. And I think that is actually more of a hindrance to the process of making sure that I have clarity around it, right? And so the clinician may not have the comfort or the assertiveness that I have to say, well, she's not in the office today, or we're not going to be able to get this to you until next week, or, something of that sort. And then Grapevine Psychology is on the hook, right? So, for example, if I'll be out of town on a longer trip again later this year. And if we get something that comes in during that time, we're not able, I don't want my office manager doing that without me consulting with my liability insurance. So I think that's the protection there. I think that's the difference between, and the added level of responsibility that a group practice has versus a solo clinician.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Well, I think you probably helped your team member feel really supported, and it is scary, and still a learning experience that you're probably helping her understand and gain from.
Helping me understand and learn from, you know what I mean? What I will also say is that this was a really good reminder for anybody in your documentation process. So the way that if there is an appointment scheduled and it is canceled for any reason, late canceled, no showed, or just canceled before the 24-hour cutoff, and or maybe they use the portal to go from like Tuesday at 9 to Thursday at 2, that initial appointment stays on the schedule, and then the new one gets put on there, and all of those appointments need to have written notes. Even if it's client, we have a template that says client canceled via the portal, or we can click a box that says client use the portal to schedule for a different time and day. And the reason why is because without that note, there's no record that there was a cancellation. You may not know who canceled this for what reason, and that may be relevant to a case. So, it was a really good reminder for us. My office manager did a really good job of closing out the file. The clinician did a good job documenting her processes, and there was a diagnosis and a treatment plan, and, everything that needed to be in there was in there, which was great. But it was also a really good reminder about making sure that there's no record of something that you don't write a note for. Your calendar doesn't get printed out. It's not like there's not a log that gets printed out of everything. But even if there was, and then there was a no-show note or a no-show appointment or a canceled appointment, if there's no note, there's no context for what that's for, and there's no protection of the clinician and the practice. So that was just, I don't know, that just came up as a really good reminder. And so that'll be something that I talk about with the team next week.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's helpful for me when if somebody cancels and then messages me via the portal, I would probably, assume like, okay, well, it's going to be in the message history, but I would have to dig into that and figure that out. And this sounds a lot cleaner and a lot, you know, better of a process for your record.
So on that note, you're right. The chat history is part of the record whenever you get the full export. Otherwise, you have to do it manually. And I don't want to talk about that part anymore. But the thing is that there may be it will be documented, and maybe this is double documentation on my part, but it's also in a, that you can look at your schedule as a solo clinician saying, okay, there was a missed appointment and there's some chatter in the chat about it. But from our standpoint, where we have like an admin and then we have people working in their schedules, we need some continuity, right? Because the admin doesn't need to be reviewing everybody's messages. But if it's a cancellation note, that can clarify things from an admin perspective, right? Um, if that makes any sense. And so in that template, it also says, because I don't also then copy the portal message and put it in the note. That's too much. But I do have a checkbox that says, um, see correspondence in client's file. And that way it's just like there's a direction to where something might be further explained unnecessarily to double document in the note as well, in my opinion. But having a note of some sort is always important. So that was a good reinforcement to what we already do.
And you referenced it as like, everything was in there, but I also think it's a good reminder to stay on top of your treatment record and notes and diagnosis, all of that stuff.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
Well, thank you for sharing. And I'm sure that, other clients or therapists that have gone through this experience were probably nodding their head or just, feeling validated, affirmed, and also therapists that have not, including myself, knocking on any wood around me, not just joking, but it's very helpful to hear the process.
Absolutely. I'm glad. Whenever I was going through it, it's like, okay, I feel like I've had a few experiences that have made this easier, but it's never easy. It's always alarming. It's always uncomfortable. It always feels anxiety provoking. So it's like nothing to fear, but I want to, that first call always should be your liability insurance because they are going to guide you and coach you through because that benefits them if you do it in accordance to their process. So and then also always talk about it with colleagues. If I had been able to meet with my consultation group before this happened or just to kind of be normalized in it, I would have, but there was just a lot going on and that wasn't something that um I had the capacity for. But I wanted to talk about it with you today and kind of share the experience. And, I wanted to share it. It just was about timing and when. And so some of us might need to share at the outset or in the middle or maybe at the end. So I also want to reinforce folks getting support around it because we are not attorneys. We should not be liking this experience, right? And so we're definitely not alone in the way that we get impacted by it for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you talked about this before, but all we're doing is our jobs. And that's a good reminder not to be fearful. I think the fear part, for me at least, is like the unknown and, lawyers and attorneys and, subpoenas, like it's an environment or it's an area that has a lot of, assumed power. And, but all we're doing is our jobs.
Yes, I think that's such a perfect note to like round this out on. All we're doing is our jobs, and if you aren't doing your job, then you probably do have something to be concerned about. But if you are and you're documenting to the best of your ability and you follow those channels, all you're doing is your job and all they're doing is their job. And when we remind ourselves that we all put our pants on at in the same way every day, then it helps us to feel maybe less intimidated by that process.
We could have probably a whole hour on how do you put your pants on, because I guess there might be a left leg, right leg process.
Fair point. Somebody might just jump into their clothes. I'm gonna try that this weekend.
Tell me how that goes. Well, you kind of referenced it, but in terms of our consultation space, like I think, part of what happens for people is life happens, and summer was, it is a busier time for us, or I know we both took some trips, and some other people that we consult with are taking trips. So I also think that's just want to talk a little bit about that, like, how a consultation group maybe navigates, um, attendance, or navigates, when people necessarily can't be as consistent in certain times of the year, just what that process looks like. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
It's such an important thing to balance and honor that people have their needs that might be discrepant from ours. You know what I mean? And it's like, yeah, you're going on a long trip or a family vacay, go do that thing. But I still want to meet, right? Like there may be that kind of experience. Um, but I think it's both, right? I don't in our group, I know that nobody gets mad at anybody else for not being there. It's sort of like there's so much support and respect about everybody taking care of their needs and all that good stuff. I think it's more about, okay, but who is available? And how do you pursue that social support and just talking it through when you need to or when you're ready to, even if you're not having your formal meeting. And I know I didn't do that, but I just didn't have the bandwidth. I didn't have the need for it or the bandwidth to do that until like today, knowing that I was going to want to talk about it with you. And so I think there's nothing wrong with that either. And, if you're in a consultation group and somebody doesn't tell you something or, they're not available and they're the one you really want their opinion about, then go seek it in a way that makes good sense for their schedule and days, or accept that maybe they're not available and that, you know, they can't be your guru. So being really patient and respectful of that, I think, is the best and most professionally caring thing that we could do. I think there's that. Um, I do know that for me, I'm missing kind of some consistency. The summer has been a little less consistent for me in certain ways and in good ways in the way that I've spent my time, but also in ways where I'm just kind of getting ready to get back to that back to school routine as everybody around us is, where I think we'll have a little bit more continuity in our schedules, generally speaking. So, or at least for me anyway. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it's like first and foremost support only, and then it's about like, okay, what do I need versus what I want, and how do I meet those needs and accept that there may be a gap between what I would most prefer it to look like at that time.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I like how you referenced, like, even in our consultation group, there is an understanding that life happens and no one needs to apologize about that. And I think what allows it to work well is that there is an understood accountability that none of us are missing just to go to the pool or go, to shop. It's legitimate reasons, or family trips, or you know health reasons, or whatever. I think, but we do kind of have a ongoing process of, like, let's checking in, and we'll talk about that process of, like, wow, it feels like we haven't had all of us in the same room for a while. So I think it's good to talk about that process with your consultation group, and maybe there's different reactions, and that's great. Talk that out.
It's such a good point. It's such an important point um, to continue having that conversation. That's what makes and keeps a consultation group safe and special and um, absolutely. So I really like that. I think that's really important, and I'm glad that you brought it up for sure. And to your point of we're not going to the grocery store during our consultation time. This is time that we prioritize, and or we have planned time away, and those are two very different things versus or an emergency, right? So anyway, I echo that and want to value that for sure.
To me too, sometimes it's like, I don't know if I want to meet today. And it's just like a therapy session where the client's like, I don't know if I want to come today. Sometimes those are the best sessions. Sometimes those are the best meetings. And I think even like my process would be to be like, yeah, I'm struggling today, or like, you know I'm here, and that's half the battle. And just being open about where you're at with your process.
Such a good point about how the days whenever people most don't want to show up are the days when they most need to, from a self-care behavioral activation standpoint, for sure. And it's parallel, man. We're not different from our clients in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this was a really important conversation. I think it's going to help a lot of people, and just, something that even if you haven't gone through it, it could be something that you could go back and listen to. And um, yeah, thank you for sharing your process. And I'm just in awe of how you handled it, and knowing that it was stressful and anxiety producing, and you handled it like a boss. So great job.
Thank you. It feels reinforcing now that it's done, and it feels so relieving to be done. I can hear that. I don't know that I would have been able to hear that earlier this week because it was that duck on water panic under the water thing, but thank you. Until next time.
Yes, I will see you later, and have a great rest of your Friday.
Yeah, you too, and everybody else.
Bye.
Bye.